Chair of Wisdom time. Yote from Patreon writes, Trench soldiers often used nicknames for their enemies, such as Tommy, Bosch, Poilu, etc. A few uncommon ones I've heard are Alleyman and Froggies. Could you explain the meaning and origin of the various nicknames used, please? Please. No one ever writes please. Thank you. Okay. The war was full of nicknames, trench slang, and acronyms. They called it, so full of it, they called it the alphabet soup. Made up in a unique situation, they quickly identified themselves and their enemies by certain nicknames or used slang words for everyday commodities, and some of them are still used today. There are whole books dedicated to such trench talk. So I'll give you a few examples of trench chatter. The French used Bosch as a slang for the Germans. Well, the British used it too eventually, which derived from the word caboche, which means thick head. Another word was pointu, which translates to sharp because of the spiked helmets, the Pickelhaube the Germans wore. The French generally had a more literal humor. They called their bayonet la fourchette, the fork, or le cure-dent, the toothpick. The word poilu, translated means the hairy one, and describes the common French soldier of the Great War, which was stereotypically a more rustic man with an agricultural background who wore a bushy mustache. British slang had more cheerful yet cynical undertones to them. The name Tommy comes from the British soldier Thomas Atkins, who died after battle back in 1794 with the words, "It's all right, sir, all in a day's work." Nobody write to me about that accent. It's all right, sir, all in a day's work. He was used as the prime example of duty and behavior in a book which every British soldier received, and it quickly became known as the Tommy book. Therefore, the soldier, or who had the book, is the Tommy. The nickname Hun for the Germans is from a speech by Kaiser Wilhelm back in 1900. When he told a German expeditionary corps leaving to fight in the Boxer Rebellion in China, "Like the Huns 1,000 years ago, you shall be feared, because you shall grant no mercy." The British called the Kaiser usually the Mad Dog of Europe, or simply Big Willie. Now these are just Big Willie. These are just a few examples. There are literally hundreds of them, and you should check out one of those books to find out more about all of them. Paul Zimmerman on Facebook writes, also some questions for the Chair of Wisdom. You hear that, Chair? What did different countries call the Great War in their own languages? When was it first called the Great War? Okay. The term Weltkrieg, World War, was already printed by German newspapers in August 1914. Pretty much everyone expected the war to be a conflict of worldwide consequences right at the beginning, regardless of how long it was going to be. This stems from pre-war assumptions that a new major war between European powers was impossible, due to the fact that everybody was globally depending on each other. A new war would have to shatter all of that and drag all the colonies, and finally even the USA, into the conflict. Contrary to popular belief nowadays, they knew very well how high the stakes were in 1914. H.G. Wells published several articles in London newspapers under the name The War to End All Wars. The length and the scale of the fighting and dying did stun everybody, of course. It was quickly referred to as the war, La Grande Guerre, Der Große Krieg, as if no war was ever going to be or could be as big as the one they were now fighting. It was the great thunder that people prophesied before, which broke the tensions of Europe, the madness that gripped the nations, and the great tragedy that would engulf the continent. Nobody really expected that anything would ever be as close to the events of 1914 to 1918. Ronald Moose writes, "Hey Indy, Flo, and the staff of the Great War. Great job with the show. I've been hooked since about episode 1 and watch faithfully when every video comes out. And now finally have an out of the trenches question." We've had 200 episodes, including the specials? I'm glad you got there. Okay. What were the ways landmines were used in World War I? Would either side have time to lay them in no man's land before the other side went over the top? Or if the Russians tried to stop the German advance with them? I hope this hasn't been asked before or covered on your show. Google doesn't give much information on the topic. Thanks for all your hard work, guys and gals. Okay. The term mine was used differently back in the day. It was usually associated with miners or pioneers that used the ancient technique of literally undermining enemy positions with tunnels and then blowing them up with explosives. And the Germans called their field mortars Minenwerfer, mine throwers. What you probably think of when you think of landmine is an explosive trap, often triggered by stepping on it. Now, although the idea of explosive traps is as old as, well, gunpowder itself, the Great War did not see the usage of anti-personnel mines on a bigger scale than some strategically placed tripwire explosions, more often used in guerrilla war in the African colonies. Landmines were absent on the Western Front, probably because of the nature of attack and counterattack through no man's land. It seemed too dangerous for either side to place them. But what the Great War developed were anti-tank mines. After the First Battle of Cambrai, the Germans had to figure out a way to deal with these slow-moving metal things crawling towards them through no man's land. They improvised at first with mortar or artillery shells buried underground with pressure mechanisms. In 1918, they produced the first anti-tank boxes and different variations of the Flachmine, usually designed in a way that would ignore the weight of a human soldier. The cartridge would break when the weight of a tank drove over it. The amount of high explosive varied, as did the design of the mines, but it could go up to 20 kilos of explosives, designed to exploit the vulnerable parts of the tank, the treads, and the underside. They were still far from being anything more than prototypes, but they would be responsible for around 15% of tank casualties during the war. If you would also like to be able to live chat with us once in a while, support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to learn more about the Salonika front, you can click here to check that out. And definitely like us on Facebook. See you next time.